analysis of public-private interplay frameworks in development of rural telecommunications. It's a multi-case study, and it was carried out here in CMI, Aalborg University, and at different other places as well. Within the 45 minutes, which I believe starts now, I will introduce the research, and of course, the research question, the scope of study, a brief look in the methodology, not too deep because there was a lot went in there, and we'll spend a little more time in the PPI framework and in the conclusion. This research was all about looking for a public-private interplay framework that would aid in developing telecom infrastructure in rural areas. And the telecom infrastructure we're talking about here is broadband, and the service of interest is broadband internet service in rural areas, in developing countries. That was how this research started. And the problem here was from the ITU statistic that I got and from literature was that there is low broadband penetration in sub-Saharan Africa and globally as well, especially fixed broadband. And of course, there is moderate broadband penetration globally, but in sub-Saharan Africa, that was quite low. And when we also looked at internet usage, mobile broadband infrastructure in specifics, we realized that the penetration was low, so that necessitated this research. And the implication of the problem here is that with the low penetration of broadband infrastructure in rural areas, national governments cannot attain universal access and service policies that they have slated for themselves in the development of broadband. So that will result in true access gaps, smart subsidy zones as well. And developing countries are affected much more than developed countries because a lot is going on there. So the idea was to propose a solution, to look for that solution, that handshake that we see over there, that will enable the development of any form of affordable infrastructure in rural areas so that these beautiful people here can have access to ICTs in rural areas. And the implication of the problem, like I mentioned earlier, would be the attainment of universal access and service. But I had to put a caveat here. I am not claiming that public-private interplay will result in universal access and service. All I'm claiming here is that public-private interplay has the potential of leading to universal access and service in different countries and in different jurisdictions. And if you look at this scale, you could see, I call this scale the universal access and service scale. This does not imply that where the market forces operate, that there is no public-private interplay. Rather, what I'm saying here is that we need more PPIs, more public-private interplays in rural areas to balance the scale. And I also had to define what public-private interplay was, and I had to look at it as a combination or leveraging of resources of the public sector and private sector to develop broadband infrastructure. So this could come in various forms, whether it's in form of corporations, collaborations, partnerships. I mean, that's what I was looking for. So I wasn't necessarily looking for a PPP or a joint venture. I was just looking for a public-private interplay that would work. And the research question here, of course, since we were going out there, I was going out there to search for a public-private interplay that would work for developing countries. That had to be the research question. What would be this public-private interplay? And of course, there are hundreds of developing countries all over the world, so it's not possible to investigate into all of them. So I had to narrow it down to sub-Saharan Africa, where there is greater need, and then to Ghana and Nigeria, not because there is greater need, but because there is the potential of whatever I'm trying to propose working in that area. And the reason that potential came to be was when I looked at the map, there are other larger maps that show the problem, but what I decided to do was just to look at the markets in both sides and what's going on there, and discover that in the development of GSM and in the development of fixed wireless, fixed wired in these countries, a lot is going on there, but very little is going on in the development of mobile broadband and fixed broadband. So that is where the problem is that I'm trying to solve here. Because in the other sections, I could discover that the market is doing very well. So hence, there would be no need for research in that area as such. I may be wrong anyway. So the sub-questions that had to support the main research question was basically, how would this public-private interplay be organized and how would it be financed? And this is not something that I had to manufacture from my head, so I had to go somewhere to see where there are such initiatives taking place and how could that fit into Nigeria and how could that fit into Ghana. But at the end of the day, from the research, I discovered that it had global implications. So in order to do that, I had to split the study into two. I had the primary case study and the secondary case study. And in the primary case study, I had to look for bottom-up initiatives where people facilitated broadband development, either with or without the aid of public health. So, and see how did this happen, what happened here, and how can that be replicated in Nigeria and in Ghana. And in the secondary cases, I had to look at the public agencies that were already that already had the mandate to develop broadband infrastructure in rural areas, to understand what are they doing, which stakeholders are they working with, and how could the stakeholders identified here work here, and how could we develop that partnership and that framework. The methodology, in order to carry out this research, I needed flexibility. So I decided to pick the interpretivist paradigm and constructivist paradigm. Interpretivist because I wanted to look at the social actors, understand them, and interpret their social actions in their environment, and at the end of the day, construct something out of it. That was my major aim of taking this approach. And of course, it had to be a multi-case study, and I had to use the actor network theory to investigate the primary cases and to validate it with the grounded theory. The surprise finding here was that when I used the grounded theory, I accidentally realized that I could realize how people were able to modelize themselves. So I could not put that out of the thesis, so I had to bring that in, but the initial aim was to validate. And in the secondary cases, since I was interested in understanding which stakeholders that the universality funds would work with, I had to use stakeholder theory. Stakeholders theory salience by Mitchell, Adel, and Wood. I couldn't use Freeman's approach because it did not fit into what I was trying to do. So what I did was to look at the outcome of the primary case and the secondary case and do a cross-synthesis analysis and then bring out the PPI model at the end of the day. And from the actor network theory, I was able to identify the relevant actors in the case, how they were able to interact with each other, and how the PPI arrangements were identified, how they were organized, because that's what we're looking for in the research questions. How could they be organized? How could they be financed? So that was one of the things I was looking for. And I was also interested in the financial arrangements in those places in order to gain inspiration for the other side as well. And of course, it provided inspiration. What I learned, one important thing that came out from the actor network theory was my belief that the PPI model should be people-owned. And from the grounded theory, I had to follow the Strauss and Corbin tradition. I used that tradition. Chalmers has a good tradition, not Strauss and Corbin. Anyway, I'll remember it along the way. But they have a good tradition. But I use Strauss and Corbin because it was easy to theorize. So I did not want to go through different angles of mixing grounded theory approaches. So they just have open coding, axial coding, and selective coding. And I was only interested in what was going on here, not to go into very complicated issues. So at the end of the day, I was able to follow the processes listed here, and I was able to come out with two sets of models. The first set of models was the developed country model, where I studied the primary cases in the developed countries and find out what was the process that led to implementation. What causal factors led to actions and interactions, according to Strauss and Corbin, that led to implementation. And these were the plausible models that came out. They are all the same. The difference is just in the middle. But I prefer the first one. I could, of course, explain that later. But in the developing country case, I realized that there was a different scenario in most of the cases. And the reason there was this different scenario was because they did not have money, but they did not have, most of them, it was a case where one or two persons initiated these initiatives and people had to join along the way. So I discovered that there was an iteration until they were able to raise enough money to deploy in a large scale. So which was different from the developed country initiative. At the end of the day, this is what I could theorize at the end of the day. And of course, we had one public sector case from Sweden, and that one wasn't difficult to look at. So, but this is the model that came out at the end of the day. Now, for the secondary case studies, this is the theoretical framework of Mitchell, Agel, and Wood, and they need us to understand the set of stakeholders that managers consider to be important. And for them, they are interested in stakeholders with high salience and stakeholders with medium salience. And the stakeholders with low salience are the ones that you ignore. So my search in finding out the stakeholders that would work in Nigeria and in Ghana was to identify those with medium salience that could become definitive stakeholders as well. And also they identify definitive stakeholders. So at the end of the day, I had to use, the acts, legal acts that establish this universal service and funds in order to identify the legitimacy of these stakeholders. And the findings there was that, of course, there were similar stakeholders from the secondary case that we could see in the primary cases. And there were stakeholders that were definite stakeholders, which were the communities in which the universality funds were meant to serve. And I also realized that the NGOs, international development organizations, were dominant and dependent stakeholders who were expectant stakeholders who could become definite stakeholders or could be worked with as expectant stakeholders. Okay, I have explained this already. So the PPI framework, at the end of it all, I had to sum up what were the things that I learned from both studies. One, people groups were identified in Ghana and in Nigeria, so it's possible to develop the PPI framework there. And the people groups were communities, social enterprises, NGOs, broadband corporations. And as I mentioned earlier on, the actors were similar in the primary case as also in the secondary cases. Not too similar, not exactly the same, but similar. And I also realized that it was very possible for people to organize themselves. This came up with the Ghana Wireless Project. It was after looking into that case that I realized that it was possible. And I also had to look at non-telecom cases as well, where people in sub-rural Africa developed water supply, electricity, and the rest of it. And I realized that it was possible for people to do this, but on a long run, not in a short term. And in order to develop the PPI framework, unfortunately, I was biased with PPP. And the reason I was biased with PPP in a sense was because somehow I had a more clearer structure in who should manage, who should build, who should maintain, who should finance. But the problem here was that I couldn't fit it into a specific PPP business model like DBO or DBFMO, as I stated in the thesis. The reason I did not do that was because I wanted the profit-making private sector out of the business. I wanted people to own it. And the reason I wanted people to own it is because there is this idea of when people develop an infrastructure, it is our thing. But when the private sector develops the infrastructure and brings it to them, it is their thing. So it was an issue of sustainability that I had to look at on the long run. So at the end of it all, I discovered that any of them could play any of these roles, but when it comes to ownership, it has to be with the people. And in terms of affordability, I discovered that this has to be long-term financing. When it comes to revenue, the people have to pay. If the people realize that it is their thing, they will build a business model that will enable them to pay, because it is not a profit-making entity as such. And like I mentioned in the thesis, this is just a stopgap measure for the market, not necessarily something for the long run. That is why we have those implementation models as well. And one of the things that came to mind, which I don't think public institutions would really enjoy that, recommendation, was that public institutions should not, if they invest in this infrastructure, they should not think of getting money back from it on the long run. They should see it as a way of propping up the market and knowing that they can get money back when the private sector moves into the area on the long run. And this is all about, attaining universal access and service. And I got this from the Swedish case when we went to Halari, where the profit-making private sector was hired by the people. And I thought that if they have to come in here, then they have to be hired by the people, else it will lead to issues of bankability, and I do not see any bank funding this project. So that is why I had to eliminate bankability from this project, because it's the people. When I looked at the regulatory risk from the Ghana and Nigeria standpoint, I did not really see one clearly. But as I pondered over it with time, I said, well, there could be a military coup and it could be nationalized. But however, I don't foresee that happening in future anyway. But anyway, when we looked at it, they are market-oriented countries and they won't nationalize these projects. It's for the people. When I looked at the commercial risk, I discovered that the universality funds will bear supply risk. One of where they will bear a greater risk is creating awareness, using the models that I discovered from grounded theory to create awareness, to get the people, to get the vital resources, to lead towards implementation. That will bring in, administrative costs along the way. So they are going to spend a lot of money over there as well. And of course, they will also, in some cases, they'll have to contribute money into this PPI initiative. For the demand risk that is borne by the people, they develop their business model and they develop how they have to pay for that. And this is the PPI framework that came out after all those thinking and that came through my mind. And of course, I know that that is debatable when we talk of non-profit. I have been asked that question many times. Why don't you just call it PPPP instead of PPP? And I think it's just a matter of I think it's just a matter of how people look at it. I mean, you could call it private sector, non-profit private sector, and profit private sector. And here, the universality funds could, if it's in the developed country, then it could be any public institution, not necessarily universality funds, because we don't have that in the in the developed countries. So they will only outsource if they need management and operations to the private sector. But in order to create a level playing field, there is need for these guys to set the agenda by regulations and selecting the private sectors that will be necessary to facilitate these types of infrastructure. And the type of infrastructure that I'm talking about here are low-cost infrastructures like Wi-Fi or any other low-cost infrastructure that is out there in the market. Can I drink water? I know time is running, but I'm almost done. Okay. Then, when I was looking at the first model, I'm African. I grew up in a rural area, not the rural area you see on the placards with people carrying. My rural area was a different rural area. But I also know that those rural areas exist, where you see people with buckets of water on their head. And the first question that came to my mind was, how does this framework fit here? I mean, these people are poor people. They don't know anything about ICTs. They don't know, how is it going to work here? So that is where I decided to come up with a second model that I call the municipality-mediated model, where the municipality will then use those frameworks that I found from grounded theory to mobilize the people and get the people ready to the point where they are willing to get money out of their pocket. I mean, people have money. Do not be deceived by the fact that they are earning $2 a day. If you go to the rural areas, I was very shocked in the course of this research to go to rural areas and see people with Chinese smartphones. So it's all about the need. That's one of the things that came up with this municipality model. So if they are able to raise the awareness of the people and get the people to see it. When I was in Tanzania, I met a village chief and I asked him, how did you get this water? We brought it. Why? Because we have need for it. What of the electricity? We brought it. The government doesn't care about us. It's because we have the need for it. Then I said, okay, what happens when it comes to mobile telephony and fixed telephony? He said, well, that's for the young people. So that means that if something has to happen there, then an awareness has to be created for them. Like I mentioned in the thesis, there are substitute routes. For example, voice over IP can replace voice telephony. And that is one internet service that can be deployed in this rural area. When I was growing up, the area that I grew up, we did not have electricity till I was 16. And I remember that my father had a generating set at his backyard, and I think I and two other neighbors were the only ones that had light at night at that time. And I realized that people were not happy about the fact that these two guys were the only ones with generator. So what they decided to do, especially loving to watch football, what they decided to do was, rather than come to my house to watch football, they decided to mobilize themselves and ask themselves, what does it cost to bring electricity to this village? And in the space of 6 years, they were able to create a business model, and they brought electricity to the village. They faced regulatory obstacles because they were told they could not buy transformers, so they had to contribute money to buy transformers. So, I mean, these things are possible. It's all about seeing the need, like I mentioned in the municipality model. And there are possibilities for this framework. If we look into Africa right now and all around the world, let's take Africa, for example, because that is where there is a great need. Of course, there's also a great need in Asia. There is a lot of fiber optic development going on, especially as a result of this national backhaul liberalization. And these fiber optics link cities. And between each city, there are lots of villages. And those are gateway possibilities for people to connect to low, cost broadband network. In developing countries, I recommend wireless network. And why I even talked of Wi-Fi was because when we went to Joslin, I realized that most of the antennas were fabricated by the people. Most of the equipment were fabricated by the people. I also saw that in India. Then I realized that, yeah, in where I come from, people fabricate TV antennas. They fabricate a lot of things. They go to metal scrap yards and they fabricate. So it is possible for these things to be fabricated if there is a technology that can fit into it. So with this backhaul connectivity, there is a potential for rural connectivity. And when you look at villages, most of them are in clusters. So you have one village in one cluster. You could have a village. This is one village. You have a lot of bushes here, but there is a community here, there is a community here, there is a community here, there is a community here. And these communities can come together and be able to put money together in able to interconnect to a fiber optic network passing by over there. This is a possibility that can happen if they see the need for it. And that is why I said there is need for public assistance. And one of the things I realized is that the market is also working in a great way in deploying broadband infrastructure in rural areas, especially with 3G, UMTS. So in that sense, I do not see a lot of patches going on, but we'll still have a lot of patches. Rural areas with no connectivity. Do we leave these rural areas behind, or do we find a solution for these rural areas? And that is where I think this project of mine fits in. So as I mentioned earlier on, there are regulatory implications over here, especially with connecting to having access to the fiber that is passing by out there. They need to have money to be able to access that. Of course, there are issues of taxation, and there are incentives that have to come up as well. There are also technical implications, because I realized that in as much as I'm studying the primary cases, these guys had problems. Some of them had to read as well. Some of them had to develop one thing or the other by themselves. But when you look at rural Africa, I don't know of rural Asia very well. I wanted to include them in this research, but I did not get a response, and rural South America. But however, if you look at rural Africa, you discover that there are people that could not make it in the city, that are living in rural areas and have no jobs and have nothing to do. There is something in their brains. And most of them can use this in order to develop most of these infrastructures and possibly business models. So there are deployment possibilities over there. So there's need for training of the people, deciding what type of infrastructure is necessary, deployment possibilities, and of course, business. We can't have a universal business model where we say, okay, for this country, this is how this PPI model should look like. Rather, the business model should be unique. People should look at their cases, how they are going to pay, how they are going to sustain it. They have need for it. They should develop unique business models. This thesis has contribution to literature, mostly. There could be other minor contributions that escaped my eyes, but this is the one that I could see very, very clearly. It agrees with some notion and disagrees with some notions. And I was a member of the school of thought that people in rural areas cannot do anything for themselves because they do not have any amount of money. They live below $2 a day and all those. But after doing this research, I changed and realized that yes, they could do something for themselves. And I also realized that we don't necessarily need a hybrid approach of where the government also has to own the infrastructure. I am very much interested in that dichotomy of making the people to be independent. I don't want this issue of our thing or your thing. I want them to own it and to know that they have it and to have that interest in it and to be proud of it, and because that is needed for sustainability. And that is what I discovered here, that there are implications here, and there is the need for regulatory approach and empowering community ownership. That was research done by Katzpekan when he was looking at these First Nation people in Canada, I think the border between Canada and the US, and looking at how they have been facilitating the development of this infrastructure. Of course, there were limitations in this research. When I started out, I sent out invitations to a lot of bottom-up initiatives. The ones from South America did not respond, and the ones I got from US, and I think I had to stop them a bit. I'm sorry about that. But most of them did not respond. I think for some it was language barrier. There was a case in the Philippines, I've forgotten the name, it had a Filipino name, that I wrote to them, but it's like their website wasn't too active. I don't know what really happened along the way. So I didn't understand that. I couldn't get that, so that was a limitation. There was also a limitation posed by distance. Apart from Ghana, Nigeria, Sweden, and Denmark, I wasn't in South Africa or in India. So I had to do face-to-face Skype interview with them, and we also had to exchange a lot of documents. And my emphasis here is on the infrastructure delivery. I would say yes, because one of the comments that was raised was, why not look at the service as well? When we started this, research, it was more of looking at, like I said, there was a little bias towards public-private partnership from the top-down approach, just analyze what is going on there. But the problem was that there was little to analyze in developing countries and what was really happening, because some were not too successful initiatives and all that. And somehow there was also a bias in me that if we are looking at this public-private partnership or that's why we even moved from public-private partnership to public-private interplay. So let's not just look at, okay, public-private partnership, but let's look at just what sort of collaboration, what sort of arrangement, what sort of business model can work around here to develop telecom infrastructure in rural areas. But along the way, I came to realize that there are bottom-up initiatives. I never knew about that. It was very interesting, and I had to investigate into that. For me, it was a surprise finding. So there was more emphasis in the infrastructure delivery. And I would say maybe it wasn't right for a researcher. Somehow I was also shocked to go to some of these villages and see people use these services. Of course, once in a while I ask them, why are you using the service, and all that. We can discuss that in the personal answer time. And so that was one of the reasons why there was that limitation. And by the time I could think of the service, I was almost 4 years into the PhD. So I didn't really have enough time. It may not be a good answer, but that's how it happened. And future works. A lot of things came out from this PhD. One of the things I have just done was to look at, in the service area that I mentioned, I realized this issue of ICT and gender. Of course, that's not part of this PhD research anyway, which I have written a book chapter with some of my colleagues. It was from something I got in Tanzania. I've not listed that here. But I think it will be necessary to look at this. I mean, okay. I think it's angry. It just wants to conclude. Anyway. But I think it would be necessary to look at the implementation model that I got from grounded theory of how to mobilize these people and getting especially these vital resources that I talked about mostly in the thesis. And I would love to do that, to go to see if that really works or if it was a figment of my imagination. And one of the things I also found out there, especially in Ghana and in some other parts of Africa, was that we have not really done an impact on the telecenter initiatives that exist there. A lot of people in rural areas can use ICTs as a result of these telecenters that were there. And I didn't come up with this. I asked one of them, how did people in your area get to know about this service? And he said, there were telecenters earlier that don't exist anymore. So people were being trained. So there's a lot of, I used the phrase latent demand in the thesis. We could debate whether it's just a need or latent demand, but I think it's important to understand how many people can really use these ICTs and services in rural areas. And of course, to test the PPI model, I think that would be a very long one. Maybe if I happen to do a very major research in the future, I would love to really look at this PPI model in a small village and see how that really works out. In conclusion, bottom-up, we can facilitate PPI through bottom-up initiatives. We can also, the design and ownership can also be to the people, but ownership has to be to the people. But one of the things I realized was that if there is any public sector in the developed or developing country that has to design this PPI for any region, a proper risk assessment has to be done. There shouldn't be any room for assumptions, because different rural areas differ from place to place. And of course, it's also very important to understand the user needs and the unique vital resources. What do these people have that can help them develop this infrastructure by themselves? And finally, that bottom-up initiatives can actually, they have the potential to lead into universal access and service. If the market is working in the city, then PPI can help in small patches in rural areas. And we can have universal access and service. And later on, we could talk of capacity and speed and whatever in future after this foundation is laid. I want to thank Morten and Reza very much for supervising this research.